Imagine a man who could have been a king, but chose to be a citizen. A man who led a ragtag army of farmers against the world's greatest emperor and won. This is not just history, it's the story of the man who invented the modern world. The story of George Washington does not begin in a palace, but in the humid, tobacco-scented air of a Virginia plantation in 1732. To the world, he would become a giant. But as a child, George was a boy defined by loss and a desperate need to prove his worth. At just 11 years old, the anchor of his life snapped. His father, Augustine Washington, passed away. In the 18th century, the death of a father wasn't just an emotional blow. It was a financial catastrophe for a younger son. Under the laws of the time, the bulk of the family's wealth and the prestigious proper education went to his older half-brothers, Lawrence and Augustine Jr., while they were sent across the Atlantic to England to learn the classics, Latin, and the ways of the British elite. George was left behind. He was a boy stuck between two worlds. He had the name of a gentleman, but none of the resources to live like one. This stolen education created a hunger in George. He realized early on that if he wanted to stand among the greats, he would have to build himself from the ground up. Without a teacher, George became his own mentor. He obsessed over a famous 16th century Jesuit text called The Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. He didn't just read it. He hand-copied all 110 rules. Imagine a teenage boy by candlelight, meticulously practicing how to sit, how to speak, and how to control his temper. Rule number 1. Every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. This wasn't just about manners. It was about self-mastery. George had a legendary, explosive temper. But through these rules, he built a mask of iron that would later allow him to remain calm while cannonballs whistled past his head. He was practicing the art of being a leader before he even had a single soldier to command. At age 16, George's life took a turn toward the dangerous. He didn't find his calling in a library, but in the Blue Ridge Mountains, he became a self-taught surveyor. In the 1740s, surveying wasn't just math, it was high-stakes exploration. George took a job mapping the vast, uncharted wilderness of the Shenandoah Valley for Lord Fairfax. This was the true turning point. For months, he lived a life that would break most men. He slept on the hard, frozen ground under a single thin blanket. He swam across ice-chilled rivers and climbed mountains that had no names. He learned how to survive on what he could hunt and how to navigate through dense forests, using nothing but the stars and his compass. This rugged lifestyle transformed his physique. By his late teens, George had grown into a massive figure 6 feet 2 inches tall. In an era where the average man was barely 5'7", George was a titan. He was broad-shouldered, had hands so large they were often commented upon, and became widely known as the best horseman in Virginia. It was said that George Washington could ride any horse, no matter how wild, and stay in the saddle for days. This physical endurance was the foundation of his legend. He wasn't just a thinker. He was a survivor. But the wilderness wasn't just about trees and rivers. It was about the brewing conflict between two superpowers, Britain and France. Both empires claimed the Ohio Valley, and young George Washington found himself right in the middle of it. At age 21, with zero military experience, he was sent by the governor of Virginia on a perilous 500-mile journey to tell the French to leave British territory. It was a mission that almost killed him. On his return journey, he was shot at by Indians, fell off a raft into a freezing river, and had to spend a night in wet clothes during a blizzard. He didn't just survive. He returned with a detailed map and intelligence that made him a celebrity in the colonies. However, his next mission would lead to disaster. In a skirmish at a place called Jumonville Glen, Washington's troops fired the first shots of what would become the 7 Years' War, the first true world war. He tasted his first defeat at Fort Necessity, where he was forced to surrender to the French in a muddy, rain-soaked trench. This is a crucial part of his story. Washington learned more from his failures than his victories. He realized that bravery without strategy was useless. He returned home not as a defeated boy, but as a man who had looked death in the face and decided he liked the challenge. Perhaps the most YouTube-worthy moment of his early life happened during the Battle of the Manassas. Washington was an aide to British General Braddock. The British were ambushed by French and Indian forces. It was a slaughter. Every other officer on horseback was shot and killed. Braddock himself was mortally wounded. Washington, despite suffering from a high fever and painful internal issues, leaped into action. He rode back and forth across the battlefield, delivering orders and trying to organize a retreat. By the end of the day, his coat had 4 bullet holes in it, and 2 horses had been shot out from under him. Yet, not a single bullet touched his skin. When the news reached the tribes who fought against him, a prophecy began to spread. An Indian chief later said, "The Great Spirit protects that man. He cannot die in battle." Hush, 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 the transition to leader. By the time George returned to his home at Mount Vernon in his late 20s, he was no longer the awkward boy struggling with his father's loss. He was a seasoned veteran, a master of the land, and a man whose name commanded respect across the colonies. He married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow, which finally gave him the financial stability he had craved since he was 11. He spent the next 15 years as a successful planter, but the fire of the frontier never left him. He watched as the British Parliament began to squeeze the colonies with taxes, treating the Americans who had fought and bled for the Emperor as second-class citizens. Washington's quiet exterior hid a boiling resentment. He wasn't a man of many words, but he was a man of immense principle. When the call for a Continental Congress came in 1774, Washington didn't just show up to talk. He showed up in his old red and blue Virginia militia uniform. He was sending a silent, powerful message. I am ready to fight. He didn't know that he was about to lead a revolution that would topple an empire. He didn't know he would be the one to hold 13 divided colonies together by the skin of his teeth, but the boy who had taught himself manners, the surveyor who had conquered the wilderness, and the soldier who had survived 4 bullets through his coat, was ready. George Washington didn't become a hero at the end of the Revolution. He became a hero in the silent years of his youth, where he chose to build a giant out of a broken boy. Have you ever wondered what it takes to change the world? Not just a little bit, but to flip society on its head, to challenge an empire, to spark a revolution against all odds. Today, we're rediving into one of the most improbable and influential events in modern history. The American Revolution. Forget the dry textbook version. We're going to explore the grit, the gambles, and the sheer audacity of a handful of colonists who dared to take on the mightiest superpower of their time. So, picture this. It's the mid-1700s. The British Empire is the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. Its navy rules the seas. Its coffers are full, and its territories stretch across the globe. On the other side of the Atlantic, you have 13 scrappy colonies, populated by farmers, merchants, and artisans. They're technically British subjects, but an ocean of separation has given them a unique sense of identity and a taste for self-governance. For a long time, things were okay. The colonies were a profitable part of the empire, and Britain mostly left them to their own devices. This policy was called salutary neglect, a fancy way of saying, as long as the money flows, we won't meddle too much. But then, everything changed. The turning point was the 7 Years' War, or as it was known in America, the French and Indian War. It was a massive, global conflict, and Britain won, big time. They kicked the French out of North America and became the dominant European power. But victory came at a staggering cost. The British government was drowning in debt, and they looked at the American colonies, which had benefited from the protection of the British military, and thought, it's time they started paying their fair share. This is where the trouble really begins. Parliament in London started passing a series of taxes directly on the colonists. First came the Sugar Act, then the Stamp Act in 1765. This one was a big deal. It wasn't about the cost of the stamps on paper goods. It was about the principle. The colonists had no representatives in the British Parliament, so, from their perspective, a distant government was taxing them without their consent. The cry of no taxation without representation erupted across the colonies. It wasn't just a catchy slogan. It was the core of their argument. They believed it violated their fundamental rights as Englishmen. Protests broke out. Groups like the Sons of Liberty formed, organizing boycotts of British goods. The pressure was so intense that Parliament actually repealed the Stamp Act. A victory, right? Well, not exactly. At the same time, they passed a declaratory act, basically saying, we're taking back this one tax. But just so you know, we still have the right to tax you however and whenever we want. The message was clear. London was still in charge. The tension just kept building. More taxes, like the Townshend tax on goods like tea, glass, and paper, led to more boycotts and more friction. British soldiers, known as Redcoats, were sent to Boston to keep order, but their presence only made things worse. The city was a powder keg, and on a cold March night in 1770, it exploded. A street brawl between colonists and a squad of British soldiers escalated into the Boston Massacre. When the smoke cleared, 5 civilians were dead. Patriots like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams used the event as powerful propaganda, painting the British as brutal oppressors. The fire of revolution was being kindled. Then came the Boston Tea Party in 1773. In protest of a new tea tax designed to bail out the struggling British East India Company, a group of colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped over 300 chests of tea into the water. This wasn't just a protest. It was a direct, multi-million-dollar act of defiance. King George III and Parliament were furious. Their response was swift and harsh. They passed a series of laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. They closed Boston Harbor, shut down Massachusetts' government, and forced colonists to house British soldiers. Instead of crushing the rebellion, these acts united the colonies in opposition. They saw it as proof that Britain intended to strip away all their freedoms. In 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They weren't calling for independence just yet. They sent a petition to the king, hoping for a peaceful resolution. But they also called for a full-scale boycott of British goods and urged the colonies to start training their militias. They were hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst. The worst came on April 19, 1775. British troops marched out of Boston to seize a hidden cache of colonial weapons in the nearby town of Concord. But the colonists were watching. Riders like Paul Revere fanned out across the countryside, sounding the alarm. At Lexington, a small group of local militiamen, the Minutemen, stood their ground on the town green. A shot rang out. The shot echoed round the world, and a revolution began. The British easily scattered the militia at Lexington, but faced a different story on their march back from Thousands of militiamen, hiding behind trees, stone walls, and houses, rained fire down on the retreating Redcoats. It was a brutal, bloody retreat for the most professional army in the world. The war had begun. Now, let's be real about the odds. The colonists faced a global superpower. Britain had a professional, well-trained army, the world's most dominant navy, and a vast treasury to fund the war. The Americans, they had a collection of volunteer militias and the newly formed, barely funded Continental Army, led by a Virginia planter named George Washington. Their soldiers were farmers and shopkeepers, often without proper uniforms, shoes, or even enough gunpowder. They were outmanned, outgunned, and outfinanced. On paper, it was an impossible fight. The early years of the war were brutal for the Americans. Washington's army was repeatedly defeated, chased out of New York, and forced into a desperate retreat across New Jersey. Morale was at rock bottom. Many believed the revolution was on the verge of collapse. But Washington was a master of survival. He knew he couldn't beat the British in a straight-up fight. His strategy was to keep the army alive, to wear the British down, to win small victories, and to keep the spirit of the revolution burning. And then, on a freezing Christmas night in 1776, he pulled off a miracle. He led his ragged army across the icy Delaware River and launched a surprise attack on a garrison of Hessian mercenaries at Trenton. It was a stunning victory, followed by another at Princeton just days later. These wins were small in a military sense, but they were a massive boost to American morale. They proved the Continental Army could fight and win. It saved the revolution from extinction. Still, the key to ultimate victory lay across the ocean. The Americans knew they couldn't win without help. They sent their most famous diplomat, Benjamin Franklin, to Paris to persuade France, Britain's old rival, to join the war. The French were sympathetic, but they weren't going to back a losing horse. They needed proof that the Americans could actually win a major battle. That proof came in 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. An entire British army, bogged down in the American wilderness and surrounded by Continental forces, was forced to surrender. Saratoga was the turning point of the war. It convinced the French that the American cause was viable. In 1778, France officially entered the war on the side of the Americans, followed by Spain and the Netherlands. Suddenly, Britain was fighting not just a colonial rebellion, but a world war. Their resources were stretched thin, their navy was challenged, and they had to defend their interests across the globe. The French alliance brought the Americans what they desperately needed: money, weapons, and, most importantly, a powerful navy. The final act of the war played out in the South. In 1781, the main British army, under General Cornwallis, marched into Virginia and set up a base at Yorktown, a port city on the coast. It was a fatal mistake. Washington, in a brilliant move, coordinated with the French army and navy. He secretly marched his army south to surround Yorktown by land, while the French fleet sailed into the Chesapeake Bay, blocking any British escape or reinforcement by sea. Cornwallis was trapped. After a 3-week siege, he had no choice. On October 19, 1781, the British army surrendered. The world was turned upside down. The fighting was over. The impossible had happened. A band of rebels, through sheer determination, strategic genius, and a crucial alliance, had defeated a global empire. The 1783 Treaty of Paris officially recognized the United States of America as an independent nation. The fire that was lit with protests against a simple tax had now forged a new country, one founded on the radical ideas of liberty, self-governance, and the rights of the people. It was a revolution that not only created a nation but also inspired countless others around the world to fight for their own freedom. The odds were impossible. The cause seemed hopeless, but in the end, the fire of revolution prevailed. Thanks for joining me on this journey through one of history's greatest underdog stories. If you found this as fascinating as I do, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what other historical long shots you'd like to explore. See you next time. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to hold ultimate power? To have the world at your feet, armies at your command, and a crown upon your head? Most of us have probably daydreamed about it. But what if, when offered that very crown, you said, no? It sounds like madness, right? To turn down the one thing so many have fought and died for throughout history. Yet, this incredible act of refusal, this great surrender, has happened more times than you might think. And the stories behind these decisions are some of the most fascinating and profound in all of history. Today, we're diving deep into the psychology of power and temptation. We'll explore the lives of remarkable individuals who were on the brink of absolute authority, looked it straight in the eye, and walked away. These aren't just tales of humility. They are complex stories of duty, philosophy, love, and sometimes a chilling understanding of what power truly does to the human soul. So, get ready, because we're about to uncover why refusing a crown might just be the most powerful move of all. Let's start with a name you might know, but a story you probably don't. So, imagine ancient Rome, around 458 BC. The city is in crisis, its army surrounded and on the verge of annihilation. Panic fills the streets. In their desperation, the Roman Senate turns to one man, Lucius Quincius. They find him not in a grand villa, but in his field, literally plowing his land. The senators arrive, dressed in their finest robes, and beg him to become the dictator of Rome, a position of absolute, unchecked power of the Republic. Cincinnatus doesn't hesitate. He puts down his plow, accepts the responsibility, and marches off to lead the army. In a stunning display of military genius, he defeats the enemy in just 16 days. Rome is obeyed. The people cheer his name, ready to follow him anywhere. He has total control. And what does he do with this absolute power? He gives it back. He resigns as dictator, hangs up his sword, and goes right back to his farm and his plow. He held the fate of Rome in his hands and chose the simple life of a citizen. This act became a legend, a benchmark for leadership and civic virtue that would inspire generations, including figures like George Washington. Cincinnatus showed the world that true greatness isn't about seizing power, but knowing when to let it go. Now, let us fast forward a couple of thousand years to a story of love and scandal that shook an empire to its core. We're in 1936. Britain, King George V has just died, and his eldest son ascends to the throne as King Edward VIII. He's popular, charismatic, and the head of the largest empire the world has ever seen. But there's a problem. Edward is deeply in love with an American woman named Valise Simpson, and Valise is not just a commoner. She is a divorcee, currently in the process of her second divorce for the British establishment and the Church of England, of which the king is the head. This was simply unacceptable. The government, the royal family, and the public were thrown into a constitutional crisis. They gave him an ultimatum: the crown or the woman. He couldn't have both. For months, the king agonized. Imagine the pressure. On one side, a centuries-old tradition, an empire, a sacred duty. On the other, the love of his life. In a historic radio address that captivated the world, Edward announced his decision. He chose to abdicate. He surrendered his birthright, his title, and his kingdom for the woman I love. He became the Duke of Windsor and lived the rest of his life in exile. Was it a romantic sacrifice or a dereliction of duty? Historians still debate it, but it remains one of the most dramatic surrenders of power in modern history. All for the sake of love. But what if the reason for refusing power is far more personal and philosophical? Let's turn to the East, to the story of the man who would become the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. Born a prince in a small kingdom in Madhya Nepal, Siddhartha lived a life of unimaginable luxury. His father, the king, shielded him from all suffering. He was surrounded by beauty, pleasure, and every comfort imaginable. He was destined to inherit the throne and rule. But one day, Siddhartha ventured outside the palace walls and saw something that shattered his perfect world. He encountered an old man, a sick man, and a corpse. For the first time, he understood the reality of aging, sickness, and death. This revelation, the existence of suffering, haunted him. He realized that no amount of royal power or material wealth could save him or his people from these fundamental truths of life. The crown he was meant to wear suddenly seemed meaningless. A golden K. So, at the age of 29, he made a radical choice. He secretly left the palace, his wife, his newborn son, and his future as a king. He traded his royal robes for a simple beggar's bowl and embarked on a spiritual quest to understand the nature of suffering and find a way to end it. His great surrender wasn't about politics or love. It was a profound rejection of worldly power in search of a higher truth. By giving up his kingdom, he eventually found enlightenment and gave the world a philosophy that influences billions to this day. These stories are incredible, but they also beg the question, why is power so tempting in the first place? Neurologically, power can act like a drug. Studies have shown that it can boost dopamine and testosterone, making us feel confident, optimistic, and focused. It feels good. Power can literally change how our brains work. It can diminish empathy, making it harder to see things from other people's perspectives. Lord Acton's famous saying, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely," isn't just a clever phrase. It has a basis in psychology. The individuals we've discussed seem to have had an intuitive understanding of this danger. Perhaps Cincinnatus knew that the dictator's chair, while necessary for a moment, would poison his farmer's soul if he sat in it for too long. Perhaps Siddhartha saw that the king's power was just a grand illusion, a distraction from the real work of conquering the self. Even Edward VIII, in his own way, recognized a conflict between the power of the monarchy and the power of his personal heart, and he chose the one he felt was more authentic to him. They understood that the ultimate temptation of power isn't just about wealth or control, but about losing yourself to the role. There are other fascinating examples. 2. The Roman Emperor Diocletian, who, after stabilizing a chaotic empire, voluntarily retired to his palace to grow cabbages. When emissaries begged him to return to power, he famously replied that if they could see the magnificent cabbages he had grown with his own hands, they would never ask him to give it up. Or consider George Washington. After leading the Continental Army to victory, he was so beloved that many wanted to make him king of America. But steeped in the story of Cincinnatus, he fiercely rejected the idea. He presided over the convention that created the Constitution, and then, after serving 2 terms as the first president, he voluntarily walked away, setting a crucial precedent for the peaceful transfer of power in a democracy. These acts of surrender redefine what true strength is. In a world that often equates power with accumulation, more money, more influence, more authority, these figures show us a different path. They demonstrate the power of restraint, the wisdom of knowing your limits, and the courage to choose a different definition of a successful life. They teach us that sometimes the greatest victory isn't won on the battlefield or in the throne room, but within your own heart, in the moment you decide what truly matters. What do you think? Was Edward's abdication a romantic dream or a foolish mistake? Could you walk away from absolute power like since? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. These stories challenge our deepest assumptions about success and ambition, and they remind us that the crown isn't always the ultimate prize. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. If you found these stories as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the incredible moments that shaped our world. See you next time. Winning the war was the easy part. Now, Washington had to do something no one in history had ever done: build a stable republic in a world ruled by kings. He wasn't just the first president, he was the inventor of the job itself. The heavy crown of a republic. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City. As he placed his hand on the Bible to take the first ever presidential oath, his hand was visibly shaking. This wasn't because of age, it was because of the terrifying weight of the moment. He knew that every move he made, every word he spoke, and even the clothes he wore would set a precedent for hundreds of years to come. He didn't have a guidebook. The Constitution was only a few pages long, and very vague about what a president actually did day to day. Washington realized he was the prototype. If he acted too much like a king, the revolution would have been for nothing. If he acted too weak, the country would fall into chaos. His first major decision was about his own image. People wanted to treat him like royalty. Some suggested he should be called His Highness, the President of the United States, and protector of their liberties. Washington shut it down immediately. He chose the title Mr. President. It was a revolutionary choice, a title that suggested he was a servant of the people, not their master. The room where it happened. A cabinet of rivals. Washington knew he was the smartest man in the room when it came to law or economics. His genius was in his ability to manage brilliant, difficult people. He created the cabinet, a group of advisors to help him lead. But he didn't pick yes men. He picked the two most brilliant, most stubborn, and most opposite men in America: Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Alexander Hamilton, Treasury Secretary, a fast-talking, aggressive genius who wanted a strong central government and a powerful national bank. He wanted America to become an industrial powerhouse like England. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, a soft-spoken philosopher who feared big government. He wanted America to remain a nation of small farmers and distrusted banks and cities. For the next 8 years, Washington's office became a battlefield of ideas. Hamilton and Jefferson hated each other. They fought over everything from taxes to foreign policy. But Washington kept them both. Why? Because he knew that a leader needs to hear the clash of ideas to make the best decision. He sat between them like a father figure, forcing these two geniuses to work together to build the foundations of the American government. The Whiskey Rebellion. The first true test in 1794. Washington faced his first domestic crisis, and it was a dangerous one. Farmers in western Pennsylvania were furious over a new tax on whiskey. They began beating up tax collectors and threatened to march on Philadelphia. This was the Whiskey Rebellion. To the world, this looked like the end of the American experiment. If the government couldn't enforce its own laws, the country would collapse. Washington knew he had to act, but he didn't want to be a tyrant. In a move that remains unique in history, the 62-year-old president put back on his military uniform. He personally led a militia of 13,000 men into the Pennsylvania countryside. The mere sight of George Washington, the hero of the Revolution, riding at the head of an army, was enough to make the rebels scatter without a single shot being fired. He proved that the law of the land must be followed, but then he did something even more Washington-esque. He pardoned the rebels. He showed that the government had the strength to punish, but the mercy to forgive. The neutrality tightrope. While Washington was trying to build a country at home, a massive storm was brewing in Europe. The French Revolution had turned into a bloodbath, and France and Britain were back at war. This tore America apart. Jefferson wanted to help the French, who had helped America win its independence. Hamilton wanted to stay friendly with Britain. Bécoussi, America's economy depended on British trade. The pressure on Washington was immense. Crowds gathered outside his house, cursing his name and calling him a traitor for not helping France. Washington stood his ground. He knew America was like a young sapling tree. If it got pulled into a massive European storm, it would be uprooted and destroyed. He issued the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793. It was one of his most unpopular moves, but it was perhaps his most visionary. He put the survival of his country above his own popularity. He taught America the art of isolationism, the idea that a young nation should focus on its own growth before trying to fix the rest of the world. The agony of the press and the decision to leave by his second term. The honeymoon was over. For the first time in his life, Washington was being brutally attacked by the press. Newspapers called him a thief, an apostate, and even a senile old man. They accused him of wanting to be a king. Washington was deeply wounded. He had given 40 years of his life to public service, and now he was being treated like a villain. He was teared. His teeth were gone, replaced by uncomfortable dentures of ivory and lead, not wood as the myth suggests. His hearing was failing, and he longed for the peace of his farm. This leads to his most famous political act, the farewell address. Washington decided he would not run for a third term. He didn't just want to retire. He wanted to teach the nation one last lesson. He hired Alexander Hamilton to help him write a letter to the American people. In this address, he gave 3 prophetic warnings that still haunt politics today. 1. Beware of political parties. He warned that parties would lead to factions that would care more about winning than about the country. 2. Stay out of debt. He urged the government to be fiscally responsible and not burden future generations with debt. 3. No permanent alliances. He warned against getting too entangled in the problems of foreign nations. The peaceful transition in March 1797. Washington attended the inauguration of the second president, John Adams. This was a world-first moment. A man with total power was voluntarily handing it over to his successor in front of a crowd of citizens. One observer noted that the people in the crowd weren't cheering for Adams. They were crying for Washington. As he walked away from the ceremony, he felt a massive weight lift off his shoulders. It was no longer the general or the president. He was, at last, just George Washington again. What truly defines a legacy? Is it the towering achievements, the groundbreaking innovations, or something more profound? Something that echoes long after the applause has faded. Today, we're exploring the final chapter of a giant, a name that has been synonymous with power, progress, and an era of unprecedented change. But as the sun begins to set on this colossal figure, we're left to wonder, what will be its ultimate legacy? For decades, this giant didn't just participate in the world, it shaped it. Its influence spread across continents, touching billions of lives, often in ways we didn't even realize. Think about the very fabric of our modern lives, the way we communicate, the way we work, the way we dream. So much of it can be traced back to the audacious vision of this single entity. It was a force of nature, a juggernaut that seemed unstoppable, forever destined to reach new heights. Its story is one of spectacular ascents. It challenged the status quo, broke down old barriers, and built new worlds. It was the David that became Goliath, the underdog that became the champion. We watched in awe as it conquered one frontier after another, its name becoming a byword for excellence and ambition. It taught us to think bigger, to the Mamore, and to believe that the impossible was just a temporary obstacle. The highlight reel is breathtaking, moments of pure genius, bets that paid off spectacularly, and innovations that felt like they were pulled from science fiction. But every story has its turning points. The same relentless drive that fueled its rise also sowed the seeds of complexity. As the giant grew, so did its shadow. The world that it helped create began to change, evolving in ways that even it couldn't fully control. New challengers emerged, younger, faster, and hungrier, inspired by the very path the giant had blazed. The landscape shifted, the rules of the game were rewritten, and suddenly, the Titan found itself in unfamiliar territory. We began to see the cracks appear. Controversies arose. Questions were asked. and the once unquestionable narrative started to fray. The public's perception, once overwhelmingly positive, became more nuanced, more critical. Was the giant a benevolent creator or a dominant? Was its power a force for good or a tool for control? These weren't easy questions, and they marked a new, more turbulent phase in its existence. The giant that once moved with swift, decisive force now seemed slower, more reactive, struggling to adapt to a world that was moving on without it. This is the fascinating, poignant part of the story. The sunset, it's not a sudden collapse, but a gradual, majestic fading, like a great star at the end of its life. Its light still reaches us, but we know its most explosive days are behind it. This period forces us to look beyond the immediate headlines and quarterly reports and ask a deeper question. What is the real, lasting impact? When we sift through the noise, the triumphs, and the controversies, what remains? It's easy to focus on the tangible things, the products, the profits, the market share, but perhaps the true legacy is something less tangible. It's in the culture it created, the standards it set, and the aspirations it ignited in millions of people. It's in the generation of engineers, designers, and entrepreneurs who looked at this giant and said, I want to build something like that. The legacy is also in the lessons learned from its stumbles. It taught us about the perils of unchecked power, the importance of humility, and the necessity of evolving or facing obsolescence. Its struggles are a cautionary tale for the giants of tomorrow, a reminder that no empire, no matter how vast, is forever. This is not a story of failure, but a story of a complete life cycle, of birth, dominance, and eventual decline. So, as we watch this final, beautiful sunset, we're not just mourning the end of an era, we are witnessing the solidification of a legend. The giant's story is being absorbed into the bedrock of our collective history. It becomes a benchmark, a case study, a myth. Its name will be invoked for generations, not just for what it built, but for the entire epic journey it represents. What is its final legacy? It's the inspiration it provided. It's the conversations it started. It's the way it forced us to confront our relationship with technology, power, and progress. The giant may be fading from the center stage, but its influence is now woven into the DNA of the modern world. It's in the tools we use, the ambitions we harbor, and the questions we continue to ask about the future. The true legacy of a giant isn't just the shadow it casts at its peak, but the light that lingers long after the sun has gone down. It's a testament to the idea that even the most powerful forces are transient, but their impact, their story, can achieve a form of immortality. What do you think? What will you remember most about this giant? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to read your perspective on this incredible story. Thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed this journey, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shape our world. See you next time.